Some places remember things that people try to forget. For 10 years, Gideon Hale had lived alone on the edge of the Red Earth Desert, where the wind carried dust instead of rain and every sunset painted the horizon the color of burning copper. His cabin sat nearly 30 miles from the nearest town. Most folks thought he preferred the silence. The truth was simpler. Silence asked fewer questions. Every morning, Gideon followed the same routine. Feed the horses. Check the fences. Walk the dry creek bed behind his property. It was a life measured in small habits and long shadows. Nothing changed out there. At least, that was what he believed until the music began. The first time he heard it was just after midnight. A single note drifted through the darkness. Soft. Distant. Almost swallowed by the wind. Gideon sat upright in bed and listened. Another note followed. Then another. It sounded like a flute, though he knew that made no sense. There wasn't another soul living within 15 miles of his cabin. He stepped outside barefoot onto the cool desert ground. The moon hung low above the mesas. Silver light stretched across the sand. The music had already stopped. Only the wind remained. By sunrise, he had convinced himself it was nothing. A trick of exhaustion. Maybe the cry of some desert bird carried strangely through the canyons. But the next night, it returned. This time the melody lasted longer. Slow notes. Sad notes. The kind that seemed to belong to another century. Gideon followed the sound nearly half a mile before it disappeared again. On the third night, curiosity replaced caution. He saddled his horse and rode toward the source. The melody floated ahead of him through the darkness like a lantern just beyond reach. Across red dunes. Past weathered rock formations. Through a valley where twisted mesquite trees clung stubbornly to life. The farther he traveled, the quieter the world became. Even the insects seemed to stop singing. Then the music ended. Gideon found himself standing at the base of an ancient sandstone ridge. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Yet something felt different. His horse shifted nervously beneath him. Gideon looked toward the top of the ridge and froze. A figure stood there. A woman. Motionless against the moonlit sky. Her long dark hair moved with the wind. Her silhouette remained perfectly still. For several seconds neither moved. Gideon could not explain why, but the sight sent a strange chill through his chest. Not fear. Recognition. As though he were looking at someone from a memory he didn't know he possessed. "Ma'am," he called. His voice echoed across the rocks. The woman turned her head slightly. Just enough for him to know she had heard him. Then she stepped backward. Gone. Gideon immediately dismounted and climbed the ridge. Loose stones shifted beneath his boots. The climb took less than 2 minutes. Yet when he reached the top, there was no sign of her. No horse tracks. No footprints. No campfire. Nothing. Only sand and stone stretching endlessly beneath the moon. Gideon stood there breathing hard. Then he noticed something half buried beside a weathered rock. A small object. Long and narrow. He knelt and brushed away the dust. It was a flute carved from pale bone, etched with symbols he had never seen before. The surface felt surprisingly warm despite the cold night air. As Gideon turned it over in his hands, a sudden gust swept across the ridge. Somewhere far out in the darkness, a woman's voice whispered a single sentence. "Your father was here." The words followed Gideon all the way back to his cabin. Your father was here. He must have repeated them 100 times before sunrise. The strange thing was not that someone had spoken. The strange thing was that nobody should have known his father at all. Thomas Hale had been dead for nearly 20 years. He had left behind little more than a weathered Bible, a silver pocket watch, and a reputation for keeping his thoughts to himself. Gideon set the flute on his kitchen table and stared at it while coffee simmered over the stove. In daylight, the object looked even stranger. Fine carvings spiraled across the pale surface. Symbols curved around one another like flowing water. He ran his fingers along the grooves. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he had ever seen. By noon, he had convinced himself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Someone was playing tricks. Maybe travelers from another territory. Maybe treasure hunters passing through the desert. Yet none of those explanations felt right. The woman on the ridge had not looked like someone playing games. She had looked like someone waiting. Late that afternoon, Gideon rode into Dry Creek, the nearest town. The settlement consisted of one dusty street lined with faded storefronts and a handful of weather-beaten buildings. Most people there knew him well enough to nod but not well enough to ask questions. He preferred it that way. His first stop was the general store. Old Walter Finch sat behind the counter reading a newspaper that was already 3 weeks old. Walter had lived in the territory longer than anyone else. If there was a story buried in the desert, he was usually the man who knew it. Gideon placed the flute on the counter. Walter adjusted his spectacles and leaned forward. For a moment, his expression remained neutral. Then the color seemed to drain from his face. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. Gideon noticed the change immediately. "Out near the Red Earth Ridge." Walter looked toward the window as though checking whether someone might be listening. "That is not possible." "Why?" The old man hesitated. "Because nobody has seen one of these in more than 20 years. Gideon felt a knot tighten in his chest. "Seen one of what?" Walter lowered his voice. "A spirit flute." The name hung in the air. Gideon almost laughed. It sounded like something from an old campfire tale. Yet Walter was not smiling. "Years ago," the old man continued, "there was an Apache family that lived beyond the ridge. People said the daughter carried one wherever she went. Then one day they disappeared." "Disappeared where?" Walter shook his head. "Nobody ever knew." Gideon picked up the flute. "And my father?" That question changed everything. Walter became very still. His eyes settled on the object again. "Your father spent time out there before he married your mother." "Doing what?" "That is something he never told anyone." The answer irritated Gideon more than it satisfied him. He left town before sunset and headed home through the desert. The sky glowed orange and gold. Long shadows stretched across the sand. About halfway back, he noticed something unusual. Fresh horse tracks. They crossed the trail directly in front of him. The prints were recent. No more than an hour old. Gideon followed them for nearly half a mile until they vanished among the rocks. Not faded. Not scattered. Vanished. As if horse and rider had simply stepped out of the world. The evening wind rose around him. Then, from somewhere beyond the sandstone cliffs, the flute began to play again. This time the melody was closer than ever before. And hidden beneath the music was the faint sound of a woman's voice speaking his name. The sound should have faded with the wind. Instead, it grew clearer. Gideon sat motionless in the saddle as the melody drifted through the sandstone cliffs ahead of him. Slow notes rose and fell like distant memories. Then came the voice again. Soft. Almost impossible to hear. Yet unmistakable. Someone had spoken his name. His horse shifted beneath him, ears pointed toward the canyon. Gideon swallowed hard and guided the animal forward. The narrow passage twisted between walls of red stone that towered nearly 50 feet above the desert floor. Shadows stretched across the sand as daylight slipped away. The deeper he traveled, the cooler the air became. Every few yards he expected the music to stop. It never did. It seemed to move ahead of him, leading him somewhere. Finally the canyon opened into a hidden basin surrounded by towering cliffs. Gideon reined in immediately. At the center stood a small spring. Water shimmered beneath the fading sunlight. He stared in disbelief. He had lived in the territory for 10 years and had never heard of water existing there. Yet the surprise lasted only a moment. Because someone else was standing beside the spring. The woman from the ridge. She wore a simple buckskin dress and a dark blue shawl draped over her shoulders. Her long black hair fell almost to her waist. The flute rested in her hands. This time she did not disappear. She simply watched him. Neither spoke for several seconds. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. "Who are you?" Gideon finally asked. The woman looked toward the water before answering. "My name is Aiyana." Her voice was calm. Steady. "You have been following me." Gideon frowned. "I could say the same thing about you." For the first time, something close to a smile touched her face. "Perhaps." The answer irritated him and intrigued him at the same time. He dismounted and stepped closer. "How do you know my father's name?" Aiyana's expression changed instantly. The faint smile vanished. She looked toward the cliffs surrounding them as if searching for words hidden among the stones. "Because he came here many years ago." Gideon's pulse quickened. Walter Finch said something similar. "Nobody will tell me what happened." Aiyana studied him carefully. "Some stories are carried by people. Others are carried by the land." The answer made little sense. Yet somehow it felt important. Gideon glanced toward the spring. The water reflected the evening sky like polished glass. Then he noticed something unusual near the edge of the basin. Half buried in the sand stood a weathered wooden marker. Curious, he walked toward it. The wood had been worn smooth by decades of wind. Faded carvings covered its surface. Gideon brushed away loose sand and felt his stomach tighten. One carving matched the symbols etched into the flute. Another matched a symbol engraved inside the silver pocket watch his father had left him. He had seen it countless times growing up. Never once had he questioned it. Behind him, Aiyana spoke quietly. "Your father wore that symbol." Gideon turned sharply. "You knew him." She hesitated. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Then she nodded. "Yes." The single word struck harder than he expected. For years he had believed his father's life was simple. Ranch work. Family. Church on Sundays. Nothing extraordinary. Yet every answer he uncovered revealed another mystery waiting underneath. The sun slipped behind the cliffs. Shadows swallowed the basin. Aiyana looked toward the darkening sky. "You should leave before nightfall." Gideon shook his head. "Not until you tell me the truth." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she reached into a leather pouch hanging from her belt and removed a small photograph. Carefully she handed it to him. Gideon looked down and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The faded picture showed a younger version of his father standing beside an Apache family. And beside Thomas Hale stood a young girl with the same eyes as Aiyana. Some discoveries answer questions. Others create bigger ones. Gideon stared at the photograph while the evening wind drifted through the hidden basin. The image was faded from age, its edges worn and cracked. Yet there was no mistake. The man standing beside the Apache family was his father. Younger. Smiling. Looking far different from the quiet rancher Gideon remembered. For years, he had believed Thomas Hale lived an ordinary life. Now that belief was unraveling one piece at a time. He lifted his eyes toward Aiyana. "How old is this?" She looked at the photograph carefully. "About 22 years. Gideon looked down again. The young girl beside his father could not have been more than 10 years old. Her dark eyes seemed familiar. Her expression felt familiar too. Then realization settled into place. "That girl is you." Aiyana nodded once. Neither pride nor sadness appeared in her face. Only certainty. Gideon felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. My father knew your family. Yes. Why did he never tell anyone? Aiyana turned toward the spring. The fading sunlight reflected across the water and painted gold across the surface. Because some promises are difficult to explain. The answer frustrated him. Every answer seemed to open another locked door. Gideon folded the photograph carefully and returned it. Then explain it to me. For several seconds she said nothing. The desert remained silent around them. Finally she walked toward a flat stone near the water and sat down. When I was a child, she began, my grandfather was the keeper of stories for our people. He believed every person leaves an echo behind. Not a ghost. Not a spirit. An echo. A memory carried by the land itself. Gideon listened without interrupting. Most people never hear those echoes, she continued. They are too busy listening to themselves. Her gaze drifted toward the cliffs. Surrounding them. Your father listened. The words lingered in the air. Gideon remembered countless evenings sitting on the porch beside Thomas Hale. His father had often stared toward the western horizon in silence. At the time, Gideon thought he was simply tired from work. Now he wondered what memories had been passing through his mind. Aiyana reached into her pouch again. This time she removed a small leather journal. The cover was faded from years of use. She handed it to him. Gideon opened the first page. His breath caught instantly. The handwriting belonged to his father. He recognized it immediately. Every letter. Every stroke. Where did you get this? Aiyana's expression softened slightly. He left it here. Gideon carefully turned the pages. Most were filled with notes about weather, landmarks, and sketches of desert plants. Then he found something different. A drawing. The same symbol carved into the flute. The same symbol engraved inside his pocket watch. Beneath it were 6 words written in neat handwriting. The desert remembers what people forget. Gideon read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Something about it felt important. Almost like a warning. The last page contained only a single unfinished entry. The ink had faded, but the words remained clear. If anything happens to me, she must never lose the flute. Gideon looked up immediately. Who is she? Aiyana did not answer right away. Instead she looked toward the darkening horizon. Night had begun to settle over the basin. Stars appeared one by one above the cliffs. The spring reflected them like scattered diamonds. Finally she spoke. That is the question that changed everything. Gideon waited. Aiyana slowly rose to her feet. Her eyes remained fixed on something beyond the canyon walls. And someone has been searching for that answer ever since your father disappeared from this place. The desert feels different after sunset. During the day, it looks empty. At night, it feels as though something is watching. Gideon stood beside the spring, staring at Aiyana while her final words echoed through his mind. Someone had been searching. Ever since his father disappeared from this place. The statement carried weight. Not because of what it revealed, but because of what it left unsaid. Gideon closed the journal carefully and held it against his chest. The worn leather felt warm despite the cool night air. Who has been searching? He asked. Aiyana looked toward the stars. A man named Samuel Voss. Gideon frowned. The name meant nothing to him. Who is he? For the first time, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. A collector of stories. At least that is what he calls himself. The answer felt incomplete. And what does he really collect? Aiyana's gaze returned to him. Secrets. The word settled heavily between them. A faint breeze rippled across the surface of the spring. Somewhere high above, an owl called into the darkness. Gideon glanced down at the journal again. What does this Samuel Voss want with my father? The same thing he has wanted for 20 years. Which is? Aiyana hesitated. The place hidden inside the stories. Gideon laughed softly despite himself. That makes no sense. It did not make sense to me either when I was younger. Her expression softened as old memories surfaced. Then my grandfather explained it. She crouched beside the spring and traced her fingers across the water. The reflection of the stars shattered into silver ripples. Our people believed there was a place beyond the red cliffs where memories could never be lost. Not a magical place. A real place. A hidden valley where important histories were protected. Gideon listened carefully. And my father knew where it was? He knew how to find it. The answer immediately raised another question. Then why did he never go there? Aiyana smiled sadly. Perhaps he did. Silence followed. The possibility had never occurred to him. Throughout his life, Gideon had viewed his father as predictable. Reliable. A man whose entire world revolved around family and hard work. Yet each new discovery painted a different picture. A man carrying secrets large enough to survive decades. A man connected to people Gideon had never known existed. A man who had somehow become part of a story buried beneath desert sand. Aiyana rose to her feet and walked toward the edge of the basin. Gideon followed. Together they looked across the moonlit landscape stretching beyond the canyon walls. Endless dunes glowed silver beneath the stars. Why are you showing me all this now? He asked. Her answer came quietly. Because the flute chose you. Gideon almost objected. Then he remembered finding it half buried on the ridge. The strange warmth. The symbols matching his father's watch. The photograph. The journal. None of it felt accidental anymore. You really believe that? Aiyana looked at him directly. I believe your father expected you to come someday. Before Gideon could respond, a distant sound drifted across the desert. Hoofbeats. Faint. Far away. Yet unmistakable. Both of them heard it. Aiyana's expression changed instantly. The calm vanished from her face. She stepped closer to the canyon entrance and listened carefully. The sound came again. More than one horse this time. Gideon counted at least 3 riders. Maybe 4. Are they coming here? He asked. Aiyana nodded slowly. Her eyes remained fixed on the darkness beyond the cliffs. They have been following the echoes for years. Gideon's pulse quickened. Who? The answer came barely above a whisper. The men Samuel Voss sends whenever someone gets too close to the truth. Then, for the first time since meeting her, Gideon saw genuine concern in her eyes. And now they know you have the journal. The desert can hide a man for years. It can also reveal him in a single night. Gideon listened to the distant hoofbeats as they echoed across the darkness beyond the canyon. The sound was still faint, but it was growing closer. Whoever those riders were, they knew where to look. Aiyana stepped away from the canyon entrance and returned to the spring. The moonlight reflected in her eyes as she glanced toward the journal in Gideon's hands. We do not have much time. Gideon looked toward the cliffs. Then tell me what is inside this hidden valley. Aiyana lowered herself onto the same flat stone where she had sat earlier. For a moment she seemed to be choosing between silence and trust. Finally she spoke. My grandfather called it the Valley of Echoes. Not because voices live there. Because history does. Gideon frowned. History exists everywhere. Not like this. Her voice remained calm. Generations ago, different tribes brought important records there. Maps. Stories. Agreements. Family histories. Things too valuable to lose. Gideon looked down at the journal again. Suddenly his father's notes felt heavier. More important. And Samuel Voss wants those records? Aiyana nodded. For years he has searched for proof that the valley exists. A cool wind swept through the basin. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, the hoofbeats briefly faded before returning again. Gideon realized the riders were circling, searching for an entrance. Why would he care so much, he asked. Aiyana stared at the spring. Because some people believe knowledge is power. Others believe knowledge is responsibility. The answer sounded exactly like something his father would have said. That realization unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He opened the journal again and slowly turned through the pages. Most entries remained ordinary observations. Weather patterns. Sketches. Landmarks. Then a folded piece of paper slipped free and landed near his boot. Gideon quickly picked it up. The paper was older than the journal itself. Carefully he unfolded it. A rough map appeared across the surface. Hand-drawn lines traced canyons, mesas, and dry riverbeds. Near the center sat a symbol identical to the one carved into the flute. Gideon's heart began to pound. Aiyana. She immediately recognized what he was holding. Her eyes widened slightly. I have never seen that page before. Gideon studied the map. A narrow trail extended from the hidden spring toward a section of desert he had never explored. The route ended at a mark labeled only with a single word. Remember. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The word seemed strange. Almost out of place. Yet something about it felt deliberate. As though the map itself were trying to deliver a message. Then Gideon noticed another detail. Written near the bottom was a short sentence in his father's handwriting. If you find this, trust her. His breath caught. There was no name attached. No explanation. Just those 4 words. Slowly he raised his eyes toward Aiyana. She looked as surprised as he felt. Before either could speak, a new sound broke the silence. A whistle. Sharp. Distant. Human. Both turned toward the canyon entrance. Another whistle answered from farther away. Then a third. The riders had stopped searching. Somehow, they had found the basin. Aiyana rose immediately. The calm expression she usually carried disappeared. They are closer than I thought. Gideon folded the map and slipped it into the journal. Then we leave. Aiyana looked toward the moonlit cliffs surrounding them. There is only one safe path from here. Gideon tightened his grip on the journal. And where does it lead? Aiyana's eyes moved to the symbol carved into the flute resting beside the spring. To the place your father spent 20 years trying to protect. The longest journeys often begin with a single choice. Gideon made his without speaking. He slipped the journal inside his saddlebag, secured the flap, and followed Aiyana toward the far side of the basin. The hidden spring disappeared behind them as they entered a narrow passage carved into the cliffs. Moonlight barely reached the canyon floor. Ancient stone walls rose on both sides like silent guardians. Ahead, Aiyana carried the flute in one hand and a small lantern in the other. Its warm glow painted shifting shadows across the rocks. The distant whistles had stopped, but somehow that felt worse. Silence could mean many things. It could mean the searchers had given up. Or it could mean they already knew exactly where to go. For nearly an hour they traveled through winding corridors of sandstone. The desert above seemed to vanish completely. Gideon had crossed this territory countless times over the years, yet he had never seen any of it. Hidden paths branched away in every direction. Some ended abruptly. Others disappeared into darkness. The place felt less like a canyon and more like a maze designed by time itself. Finally the passage widened into a sheltered chamber beneath an overhanging cliff. Aiyana stopped beside a cluster of smooth boulders. We can rest here for a short time. Gideon removed his hat and wiped the dust from his forehead. The cool night air carried the scent of sage and stone. For a few moments neither spoke. Then his eyes drifted toward the flute resting across her lap. "You said my father wanted to protect something." Aiyana nodded. "Yes. Was it the valley?" She considered the question carefully. "Not only the valley. The people connected to it." Gideon sat down on a nearby rock. "Including your family." "Including yours." The answer surprised him. He had expected many things during the past few days. That was not one of them. Aiyana looked toward the darkness beyond the chamber. "There is something you still do not understand." Gideon leaned forward slightly. "Then help me understand it." For several seconds she remained silent. Then she reached into another pouch hanging at her side and removed a folded piece of cloth. Carefully she opened it. Inside rested a small silver medallion. Gideon's breath caught immediately. The design matched the symbol engraved inside his father's pocket watch. Exactly. Every line. Every curve. Every detail. "Where did you get that?" he asked quietly. Aiyana handed it to him. The metal felt cool against his palm. "Your father gave it to my grandfather." Gideon turned the medallion over. Words were carved into the back. "Time fades. Truth remains." The familiar handwriting made his chest tighten. Why would he do that? Aiyana looked directly at him. "Because he trusted my family more than he trusted anyone else." The statement lingered between them. Gideon found himself wondering how many years his father had carried these relationships in secret. How many stories had been left untold. A faint smile appeared on Aiyana's face. "My grandfather used to say your father asked more questions than anyone he had ever met." Gideon laughed softly. "That sounds familiar." He wanted to understand people before he judged them. The words felt strangely personal. More than once during their journey, Gideon had caught himself making assumptions about her. About her motives. About her connection to all of this. Yet every hour spent together revealed another layer beneath the surface. Another reason to listen before speaking. Suddenly a gust of wind swept through the chamber. The lantern flickered. The flute gave off a low, haunting note all by itself. Both froze. Neither had touched it. The sound lasted only a second before fading into silence. Then Aiyana's expression changed completely. She rose to her feet and stared toward the northern passage. "Someone else is here." Gideon immediately stood. "One of Voss's men." Aiyana shook her head slowly. Her eyes never left the darkness. "No." Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "Someone who has been waiting for us. Some meetings feel planned. Others feel inevitable." Gideon stood motionless as the final note from the flute faded into the darkness. The chamber seemed smaller now. Quieter. Even the wind had disappeared. Aiyana remained focused on the northern passage, her posture tense in a way he had never seen before. Whoever she expected was not an enemy. Yet she was clearly uneasy. "Who is waiting for us?" Gideon asked. Aiyana did not answer immediately. Instead she picked up the lantern and began walking toward the passage. After a moment she spoke. "Someone my grandfather trusted." The response only deepened the mystery. Gideon followed closely as they moved deeper into the canyon system. The tunnel gradually narrowed until they were forced to walk single file. Ancient markings appeared on the stone walls. Spirals. Symbols. Carvings worn smooth by generations of desert winds. Some matched the design on the flute. Others resembled the symbol inside his father's pocket watch. The farther they traveled, the more Gideon felt as though he had stepped into a forgotten chapter of history. Nearly 20 minutes passed before the tunnel opened once more. This chamber was unlike any they had seen before. Moonlight streamed through a natural opening high above. Pale silver light illuminated dozens of carved stone pillars rising from the canyon floor. The place felt sacred without needing to announce it. At the center stood an elderly man wrapped in a dark blanket. He leaned on a wooden staff polished smooth by age. His silver hair fell to his shoulders. His face carried deep lines carved by time, weather, and wisdom. Yet it was his eyes that immediately captured Gideon's attention. They were sharp, alert, waiting. The old man smiled softly when he saw Aiyana. "You finally brought him." Aiyana lowered her head respectfully. The path revealed itself. The old man nodded as though that answer confirmed something important. Then his attention shifted to Gideon. For several seconds he simply studied him. Not his clothes. Not his saddlebag. Him. "You look more like your mother," the old man said quietly. Gideon's breath caught. "You knew my parents?" "I knew your father." The answer sent another wave of questions crashing through his mind. The old man motioned toward a nearby stone bench. "Sit. There is little time, and much has been hidden from you." Gideon obeyed. Something about the man's presence made argument feel unnecessary. The old man settled onto the opposite bench. The lantern cast warm light across his weathered features. "My name is Nantan." Gideon nodded politely. "Aiyana says my father spent years protecting something." Nantan smiled faintly. "He spent years protecting many things. Then why keep secrets from me?" For the first time, sadness crossed the old man's face. "Because he hoped you would never need to carry them." The answer felt painfully familiar. It sounded exactly like the kind of sacrifice a father might make. Nantan reached beneath his blanket and produced a small wooden box. The box looked ancient. Its corners had been reinforced with copper. Strange symbols decorated the lid. Slowly he placed it between them. This belonged to Thomas Hale. Gideon stared at it. Every instinct told him the box contained answers. Maybe not all of them. But enough to change everything. "Why give it to me now?" Nantan looked toward the opening high above the chamber. Stars glittered overhead. "Because the search is ending." Gideon felt a chill despite the warm desert air. "What does that mean?" Nantan rested both hands on his staff. "For 20 years, Samuel Voss has searched for the Valley of Echoes." His voice lowered. "Yesterday, he found the first marker." Silence filled the chamber. Gideon glanced toward Aiyana. Her expression confirmed the seriousness of the statement. Then Nantan looked directly into his eyes and delivered the words. "That changed everything once again. And the final marker is hidden inside that box. The answers we spend our lives chasing rarely look the way we imagine." Gideon stared at the wooden box resting between him and Nantan. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The chamber seemed suspended outside of time. Moonlight poured through the opening above. The ancient stone pillars stood silent around them. Even the desert wind had gone still. Slowly, Gideon reached forward and lifted the lid. Inside lay a folded map, a silver compass, and a single envelope sealed with faded red wax. His heart tightened the moment he recognized the handwriting. Thomas Hale. The envelope carried only 3 words. "For my son." Gideon's fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the writing remained clear. He began to read. "If you are holding this letter, then the desert has finally decided it is time. There are places in this world worth protecting, not because they contain treasure, but because they contain truth. Years ago, I was welcomed by people who taught me something I never learned anywhere else. A man does not own history. He only carries it for a little while before passing it to someone else." Gideon paused. The words felt less like a letter and more like a conversation across time. He continued reading. The valley is not important because of what is hidden there. It is important because it reminds people who they are. If others seek it for power, they will leave disappointed. If you seek it for understanding, then you already carry what matters most. Gideon's eyes moved to the final lines. Trust Aiyana. Trust the land. And remember that some of the strongest bonds are formed between people who were never expected to walk the same road. The letter ended there. No grand revelation. No dramatic secret. Just a simple truth. For several seconds Gideon could not speak. Nantan smiled softly. Your father always preferred wisdom over mystery. Aiyana stepped closer. The lantern light reflected in her eyes. Now you understand. Gideon looked at the map inside the box. Then at the compass. Then at the woman standing beside him. For days he had believed the journey was leading toward a hidden place. A valley. A secret. A destination. Yet suddenly those things seemed secondary. The real discovery had happened long before reaching any map marker. It had happened through conversations. Through trust. Through stories shared beside springs and beneath desert stars. Nantan slowly rose to his feet. The valley will remain protected. Gideon nodded. He finally understood why his father had guarded the secret for so many years. Some things survived not because they were hidden, but because the right people chose to honor them. Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon. Soft gold spread across the desert beyond the canyon walls. Aiyana picked up the flute and held it for a moment before placing it in Gideon's hands. It belongs with you now. Gideon looked down at the carvings. The same symbols. The same echoes. Yet the object no longer felt mysterious. It felt familiar. Together they stepped out of the chamber and into the morning light. The desert stretched endlessly before them. Red cliffs. Open sky. A new day. Gideon listened carefully as the breeze crossed the sand. For the first time since this journey began, the flute did not play. The echoes had finally found their way home. And somehow, standing beside Aiyana beneath the rising sun, he realized neither of them would be walking the road ahead alone. 3 years later. The Valley of Echoes remained hidden among the red cliffs, but it was no longer a secret pursued by greed. Samuel Voss had abandoned his search after realizing that the valley held neither gold nor power, but something far more valuable, the history of the people who had come before him. Beneath the cottonwood trees that lined the ancient spring, a small home had been built. It was the place Gideon and Aiyana called home. That evening, Gideon sat on the porch, carefully repairing the old bone flute that Aiyana had once given him. The laughter of a child drifted across the meadow. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, ran through a field of wildflowers, chasing a cluster of white butterflies. Mom says you're not supposed to run too far. Gideon called with a smile. From the garden behind the house, Aiyana laughed softly. Gideon watched them both and felt a warmth spread through his heart. Sometimes he still remembered the lonely nights in the cabin at the edge of the desert. He remembered the questions that had once kept him awake. He remembered the father he thought he would never truly understand. Now everything was different. He finally understood that his father had never left behind a treasure. He had left behind a path. A path that led to trust, love, and the people worth protecting. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the red cliffs, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, Aiyana sat down beside him. She rested her head gently on his shoulder. Their daughter ran over and nestled into their arms. Gideon looked toward the glowing horizon. For the first time in his life, he was no longer searching for anything. Because at last, he had found everything. A family. A love worth cherishing. And a place to call home.